I started working at 16 in a quiet, suburban town just outside a bustling metropolis. My first job was in a small, family-owned pizzeria that had been around for decades. My duties were basic, helping in the kitchen, cleaning up, and occasionally taking orders. After a couple of months, my boss, a gruff but kind-hearted man in his 50s, approached me with a proposition. He asked if I could cover deliveries on the days when the regular delivery boy was off. Eager to prove myself, I agreed without hesitation. Things went smoothly for a while. I spent most of my shifts in the kitchen, and on the rare occasion when I had to make a delivery, it was usually to a familiar address in a safe, well-lit neighborhood. But then, one evening, everything changed. The regular delivery boy came back from a run looking like he had seen something unspeakable. His face was ashen, and his eyes were wide with fear. He walked straight past me without a word and headed into the boss's office, slamming the door behind him. I couldn't make out much of the conversation that followed, but it was clear from the muffled shouts that something was very wrong. When the door finally opened, the delivery boy emerged, his face pale and strained. He looked at me with an expression that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good luck, kid," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. Then, as if trying to dismiss the terror in his eyes, he added, "It's just a crappy job, nothing more." But the way he said it made me believe otherwise. He gave me a half-hearted pat on the back before walking out the door. That was the last time I ever saw him. The next day, my boss informed me that I would be taking over deliveries until they found a replacement. For the first couple of weeks, everything seemed normal. The deliveries were routine, and the customers were the usual mix of friendly locals and busy families. But one evening, as I was finishing up my shift, my boss handed me an address that I didn't recognize. It was in a part of town I had never been to before, on the outskirts where the city gave way to rural farmland. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road as I drove toward the address. The further I went, the more isolated the surroundings became. The houses were few and far between, separated by vast fields and dense patches of woods. When I finally arrived, I found myself in front of a dilapidated two-story house. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The lawn was overgrown with tall weeds, the trees were barren, and the porch was empty. No chairs, no decorations, just bare wood weathered by time. The windows were dark, and the air around the house was still, almost oppressive. A sense of unease settled over me, but I shook it off and got out of the car. I walked up to the front door, each step making the old wooden porch creak under my weight. I knocked on the door, half hoping there had been some mistake with the address. But then I heard the faint sound of a lock turning, and the door slowly creaked open. An old woman stood in the doorway, her frail frame barely filling the space. She looked to be in her late 70s, with thinning white hair and a face lined with deep wrinkles. Her eyes, however, were what struck me the most: cold, piercing, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Pepperoni pizza, ma'am," I said, forcing a smile as I held out the box. "Yes," she rasped, her voice dry and hoarse. But she made no move to take the pizza, just stared at it with an unsettling intensity. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Here you go," I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady as I extended the box toward her. She didn't take it. Instead, she asked in a low, almost conspiratorial tone, "Did you come with someone else?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Her gaze was unwavering, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. "No, ma'am, I'm alone," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she continued to stare at me. "Where's the other one? The one who came last time?" she asked, her voice growing more insistent. My heart skipped a beat. "He quit a few weeks ago," I replied, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. She didn't respond immediately, just continued to rummage through her purse with one hand while keeping the other hidden inside. I stood there, my nerves fraying with each passing second, wondering what she was searching for. The silence stretched on, becoming almost unbearable. Suddenly, I noticed a shadow moving behind her, a tall, dark silhouette slowly approaching the door. My pulse quickened, and before I could react, I heard the distinct crunch of leaves to my left. I turned my head slightly and saw a man peering around the corner of the porch, his face twisted in a scowl. "Hey," he barked, his voice deep and menacing. That was it. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I didn't hesitate. I dropped the pizza box, spun on my heel, and sprinted back to my car. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the keys, but somehow I managed to start the engine and peel out of the driveway. As I sped away, I didn't dare look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I finally reached the safety of the pizzeria, I was still shaking. My boss took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him what had happened, and his face went pale. He immediately called the police. A couple of days later, he informed me that the house had been foreclosed for over a year, but when the police arrived, they found 3 people living there, a woman and 2 men. They were arrested, but I never found out what they were doing there or why they had targeted delivery drivers. All I knew was that I had come far too close to something terrible that night, and the memory of it still haunts me to this day. One evening, I found myself covering a shift for my friend at the pizzeria. He was the regular delivery guy, always out on the road while I manned the register. I didn't mind helping out, and the night had been uneventful so far, just 2 deliveries to friendly, familiar faces. But as the night wore on, my manager handed me one last order. It was for a house 5 miles away, a bit further than the usual deliveries, but nothing too out of the ordinary. I set off, the GPS guiding me off the highway and into a small, quiet town that I'd never even heard of before. The streets were dark, most of the streetlights either broken or flickering ominously. The houses were old, many of them looking as if they hadn't been lived in for years. A sense of unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside. I just wanted to deliver the pizza and get out of there as quickly as possible. When I arrived at the address, I was greeted by a small single-story house that looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling and the windows were dark. I hesitated for a moment before getting out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. I rang the doorbell, and to my surprise, the door swung open almost immediately. An older man, probably in his late 50s, stood in the doorway. His hair was sparse and gray, and his skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent. A thin gray mustache clung to his upper lip, and his eyes, set deep in his gaunt face, held an unsettling gleam. He smiled at me, but there was something off about it, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Just a moment, I'll be right back," he said in a voice that was too cheerful for the situation. He turned and walked deeper into the house, leaving me standing in the doorway, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The house was cold, colder than it should have been, and the dim light from the single bulb hanging in the hallway only added to the eerie atmosphere. I could hear the floorboards creaking under the man's weight as he moved around inside, and every sound seemed to echo in the silence. After what felt like an eternity, the man reappeared, still wearing that unsettling smile. "Why don't you come inside while I get the money?" he suggested, his tone almost too friendly. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed to stay outside, but the cold was relentless, and I found myself reluctantly stepping over the threshold. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I instantly regretted my decision. The air inside was stale, and there was a faint musty odor that made my stomach turn. The man gestured toward a door at the end of the hallway. "I keep my money in the basement," he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "Would you mind coming down with me to help find it?" My heart skipped a beat. The basement door was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase that disappeared into darkness. There was no way I was going down there, no matter what. "I'll wait here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. The man's smile faltered for a moment, and I saw something dark flicker in his eyes. But before I could react, I heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from the basement, as if someone was slowly descending the stairs. Panic surged through me. I turned to leave, but the man was already blocking the door, his smile now twisted into a sneer. Without thinking, I lashed out, my fist connecting with his jaw. The force of the blow knocked him off balance, and I shoved him aside, bolting for the door. I didn't stop running until I was outside, the cold night air stinging my lungs. I jumped into my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. When the engine finally roared to life, I slammed on the gas and sped away, not daring to look back. When I returned to the pizzeria, I was still in shock. My manager took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told him what had happened, and he immediately called the cops. They investigated the house, but I never found out what they discovered. My manager gave me a few days off to recover, but the experience left me deeply shaken. I learned a hard lesson that night. Never, under any circumstances, enter a stranger's house, no matter how cold it is outside. It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself out on what would become the most harrowing delivery of my life. The order had come in late, just as I was about to clock out. 4 large pizzas, destined for an address that was a 20-minute drive from the pizzeria. It wasn't unusual for customers in rural areas to place large orders, especially if they were hosting a party, so I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it would be a simple drop-off, maybe with a decent tip as a bonus. The drive out there was uneventful, but as I turned off the main road onto a narrow, dirt path, a sense of unease began to settle over me. The road was barely wide enough for my car, and the trees on either side loomed overhead, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers in the darkness. The only light came from my headlights, cutting through the inky blackness ahead. Finally, I arrived at the address, a dilapidated building standing alone in the middle of a forest clearing. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were dark, the roof sagged under the weight of time, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to one side, as if it might collapse at any moment. I hesitated for a long moment before getting out of the car. Something about the place didn't feel right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I called my boss, asking him to double-check the address. He confirmed it was correct and, in his usual gruff manner, told me to at least knock on the door before deciding to leave. Reluctantly, I approached the building, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. There was no doorbell, so I knocked loudly, the sound echoing through the still night. At first, there was no response, just an oppressive silence that made my skin crawl. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out that I was the pizza delivery guy. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from inside the building. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I knocked one last time, more out of desperation than anything else, and waited. That's when I saw it, movement in one of the windows. My breath caught in my throat as I realized there was someone staring at me from behind the glass. I couldn't make out their features, but their eyes were wide, unnaturally so, and they were locked onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I took a step back, my mind racing. Who was this person? Why were they just staring at me like that? My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Then, without warning, the figure in the window disappeared, and the rustling sound started up again, this time louder and more frantic. Panic surged through me, and I dropped the pizza boxes, turning on my heel to run back to the car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries to get the key into the ignition. But when I finally managed to start the engine, the car would move. I pressed down on the gas pedal, but the vehicle only lurched forward a few feet before coming to a grinding halt. Something was very wrong. My heart was pounding in my chest as I got out of the car to check what was going on. A chill ran down my spine as I saw that all 4 tires had been slashed, the rubber completely shredded. Someone had done this while I was knocking on the door. I was trapped. Panic took over, and I scrambled back into the car, locking the doors and grabbing my phone. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial 911. When the operator answered, I explained the situation as best I could, my voice trembling with fear. She told me to stay in the car with the doors locked, and that help was on the way. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. I kept glancing around, expecting to see the person from the window approaching the car at any moment. The forest around me was dark and silent. the only sound my own ragged breathing. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, and there was still no sign of the police. Then, as I was scanning the windows for the 100th time, I saw it. In the rearview mirror, a face was staring back at me from the back seat. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was the same person from the window. Their eyes were wide, almost impossibly so, and a slow, sinister smile was spreading across their face. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I flung the car door open and sprinted into the woods, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that building and the nightmare inside. The branches scratched at my face and arms as I ran, but I didn't stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I finally collapsed behind a large log, my lungs burning and my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I tried to control my breathing, listening for any sounds of pursuit, but the only thing I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I don't know how long I stayed there, hiding in the darkness, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the sound of sirens in the distance broke through the silence, and I forced myself to my feet, stumbling back toward the road. When I finally emerged from the trees, the flashing lights of police cars greeted me, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The officers found me in a state of near hysteria, barely able to explain what had happened. They searched the building and found nothing but a few strange, spiked objects, the kind used to slash tires. Despite their efforts, they never found the person who had been in the car with me. I quit my job the next day and started working at a local grocery store. The image of that person's wide eyes and twisted smile still haunts me, and I know I'll never forget the terror of that night. If you've made it this far, you're 100% a horror fanatic and we approve. If you love our campfire-themed horror storytelling experience, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our daily uploads.